This is actually my most favorite topic, and I'm like totally in the groove when I'm talking on scale. So you just press the right button. So I absolutely am a proponent of scale. I mean, I love the word scale because I think if you really want to change, we need to work at volume because we can go forever from door to door, village to village, house to house. We're not going to see transformation in my generation, the next 20 generations. So I think we really need to work at scale. I mean, we at Breakthrough have gone blue in our face arguing depth versus scale, quality, compromise, I don't know, everything else. So I think we've just been doing this ourselves all along, so it's not something that I'm not familiar with, but I still propose scale. I think there are a couple of things that we really need to understand in this context. We're living in times that have changed, and I can tell you this, from when we launched Bell Bajao, in India, I'm speaking in the Indian context, please, but now, of course, there is no more Indian context. We had just traditional media, television and radio. Now, we have just gone ballistic on mobile, internet, the way we engage with communities. We're the fastest growing mobile industry in the world. And this is like not the most developed nation. You'll see a guy who's loading these heavy sacks onto trucks and he's sitting and like chatting away on the phone. Now, what is he using the phone for may not be, I mean, he'll start using it for many more things, but he's talking. So, you know, it's like the funniest story that you don't have loose to go to, but you do have mobile phones. I mean, that's the kind of environment we are talking about. It's completely possible to go to scale. I think the lessons that we have to learn is that how do we push social cause? I mean, that's a big one. How do we see results? How do we bring about change? That's the question as well when you talk at scale. So I'm going to just put a point. We have to sustain. You can't just imagine one campaign, one something will change the world. We've always sustained with the community work. We've been doing it forever. Now let's just put some shoulder to the other one as well, like try and work at scale as well. Yes, it needs capacity building, it needs commitment, it needs investment. But more than that, I think what I want to propose is how do we work online and offline? How does this become a collaborative effort? It's not about just using media. How does media support on the ground? I think that's the magic that we really need to pull at. And for the last couple of years, we're really trying to see whenever we launch a campaign, how does it have feet on the ground? What is the call to action? Because we can have a happy 10 people in the room and have a session, but we still don't tell people what to do. So you can use media to tell what I should do. So I think that's important. How do we get smart about what we say, where we say it, how we say it, and then keep in touch? I think that's the big one, because today's technology allows you to stay in touch. Now, this symposium is great, and if we go away and we never communicate with each other, we're not going to move any mountains. The idea is, after this symposium, what do we do? How do we stay in touch? And that's completely possible today. So scale, scale, scale.
Scale, scale, scale. I want to ask you a question. I wonder if there's things that we could learn from both from other social movements or from your kind of media expertise that we could apply to the challenges we have around scaling up. And then I want to bring both Julio and Peng into this with some of the challenging questions around resources and how we allocate them fairly.
So I think more than scale, I think it has to be more democratic. I think diversity is more important than scale, because at an event that has 10,000 Indian rupees for just attending the conference, I mean, we're talking to a very elite group of people even here at the symposium. So I would like to see more diversity in the kind of people and experiences that are represented. I think that is more important for me than scale. And the other thing that I've learned from movements, especially other movements, is that my level of engagement with NGOs has come down drastically, because I believe that NGOs, I mean, calling them NGOs is I think a mistake. It's a misnomer, because when you say NGOs, it means non-governmental organization. I think NGOs are government agencies. They are the safety valve for a lot of frustration that people feel. So what alliance can we make really with NGOs who are registered with governments, who come under the surveillance of governments? What kind of work can we do with that alliance? And if you even look at the funding structure, it's a lot of, I think, neo-imperialist guilt of the West world, where they kind of pump in money back to the erstwhile colonies to kind of save them. So it's again the white savior model that we are seeing in NGO work. So what does this alliance really mean for people who are working with people's movements outside of these kind of structures. So that's one question that I would like to ask. And also, there is a problem when we work with the government, which is that we will never be able to address state violence. So we will never be able to address custodial violence. We will never be able to address the violence perpetuated by the Indian occupying forces in Kashmir. We will never be able to address the kind of violence that is inflicted on indigenous communities. So these are the kind of violences that get left out in this conversation, where it's more fitting into the liberal frame of violence against an abstract community of women. So I think scale, I think democratic spaces more than scale, I think, is where I would like this to go. Thank you.
Great. Julio, Peng, anything you want to add to the challenges of scaling up?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that was going through my mind as I was hearing the other Michael and them talk was like who defines success and who defines the results, right? Because when we look at, if we're really looking at working from those who are most impacted, meaning that those who are impacted by gender-based violence, that means that those who are most marginalized in doing this work, they will define success very different than those of us who are sitting and doing this work. So I think that is one question that we really have to look at, and oftentimes it comes into conflict because us as the advocates who are doing this work, who are the change makers, quote unquote, define it very different than those who are being impacted by the issue that we're trying to address. And so there was a recent article that came out in the US. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I was a colleague of mine about it. What we're I think
the change that we're encouraging, the change that we are seeking is going to be sustainable.
Deliverables of the project to be.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting discussion going on. And then from a head office perspective, when we receive reports from the projects, all of the projects will say that, we have successfully launched and done everything what we are supposed to do. I think in terms of scaling and taking it up, I think one important factor is also not to shy about from the lesson learned aspect of it. Until unless we reflect critically on the lesson learned, I don't think success will be clearly defined and it really reaches out. For me, it's also to make sure that we are bringing this learning without sighing about it, bringing this learning in the next step that we're going to do. I think that's also very important, that we reflect on those learnings and out of the processes that we are engaged in and build that into the ongoing programs. So because if you look at the reports with all the donors, I think world should be completely different if you look only the reports. So I think one way of looking at it is also to reflect and not sigh off the learning processes that we stumble upon, unlearn, relearn, that kind of processes is also very key as well.
Any other thoughts or comments? Sonali?
I think just a couple of sort of reflections on this conversation. And I think, the idea is that there is so much going on out there, and how do we occupy space is a big one. And how do we really, as a group, really ensure that there is this democratic process, there is inclusion? How do we make that happen? But again, this is the challenge. I mean, this is the challenge that then co-opting does happen. And I think everybody has raised this question, and I think G very actively raised it. How do we prevent ourselves from being co-opted? I think these are red flags that we must put out for ourselves. And I think when we have this opportunity sort of to be in the room as practitioners, this is some really deep questions we must ask ourselves. It's great to be talking to people outside, and many of us do that. But this is a space for us to reflect a bit. And I think that's the purpose that I'm seeing here, that are we really raising those red flags? The other point that I really think is how do we sort of deal with failures? So I think when we confront failures, we go back to what we feel comfortable with, and we are really not sure whenever we've been asked to get out of our comfort zones, and therefore we always fall back on the tried and tested. So I really think that there are a lot of ways in which we should consciously do the work we do, inclusive, democratic, work at intersectional. I think these are things we should just make our sort of our like sort of be second skin to us or whatever. We should just breathe this all the time, and that's how we should bring ourselves to the table. But at the same time, I think we should not fall back on comfort zones. It's very easy to critique. It's very easy to critique what's going on with the media, the way it's being just completely co-opted. We don't have spaces for ourselves. But there's nothing stopping us still to get in there and fight it. So I think that's what I'm pushing for here, is that we need to get in there. And nothing is stopping us from doing that.
Well, sometimes fear.
Fear of failure.
Right? Any other last comments on scaling up, on building capacity? I'm a little surprised nobody's talked about resources and access to and political will for driving those kinds of resources. I mean, Michael Kimmel touched a little bit on it this morning, but one of the first kind of sob stories of NGOs doing this, there's no funding, there's no money, there's nothing to do it, and then we have the added complication of competition for resources amongst ourselves and in competition with already under-resourced or virtually non-existently resourced services for women, trans, lesbian, gay, intersex folks. So any thoughts about the resource question from the panel first, and or anyone else? Why don't you go ahead here?
Actually, I'd like to touch on the resources, but not the financial resources.
Okay.
I feel it's human resources that are the problem. When you're scaling up, you need people who would be able to do the work. And our kind of work is something that people don't just walk in and know. It takes time to build capacity to do this work. So if you want to scale up and somebody comes with money, there have been times where you've refused money because you don't have the capacity, and it's not financial, it is human. So how do we look at that? I think this is a big issue that confronts us as organizations working, because it's not like as if you're a teacher, so you're taught how to be a teacher and you can go to any school. So it's not people who walk into our organizations know exactly what to do when they walk in. They come, they learn about each organization, which is different. The ways we do things, they are different. And then they're able to go in and do the work. So I think this is a big, big issue for us.
Great point.
Yeah, and I want to echo that, because as you were speaking and you said you had arguments, I think, at the office around scale or depth. And that's something I was thinking about, because gender-based violence work is really deep. So how do we scale and maintain that depth? And every context is different. I live in Uganda, I'm Ugandan. I live in the city and my village is 450 kilometers away. Even I can't walk into my village and do change-based work there, despite the fact that that's my ancestral home. So this is really deep, complex work. How do we do scale and still maintain that quality? Beyond financial resources, I think, can be mobilized if there's enough push. But the human resource and the quality issue.
I'm going to do this, Heinrich. I saw you nodding your head on the resource question, so I'm going to ask if you have any thoughts you want to share.
Okay, just.
Oh, sorry, Daniel.
Quickly, my name is Daniel. I'm from the Brazilian government, from the Ministry of Health, and just to say that I totally agree with what you were saying right now. In Brazil, the Brazilian government is starting to really pick up on the idea of running interventions with male perpetrators of violence against women, and so it's good on one side, but then we really worry about what type of professionals are going to be running these projects, because they are usually right now being developed inside the judiciary system, and these are people who usually have never been in contact with gender theories or feminist theories. So what type of work are they doing? Where are they basing their work at? Where are they coming from when they're talking about interventions with male perpetrators of violence? So it's nice that the government's picking up the idea, but at the same time, it really worries people who have been working with these issues for a long time, like Instituto Promundo, Instituto Ngos, and other Brazilian institutions that have been doing this work for like 20 years right now. So just to echo what you were saying.
Did you want to share anything, Heinrich? I saw you. You're okay? Okay. So our our beginning theme was taken over by our third theme, so this is pretty exciting. Now we can go back to something that we've already talked a bit about in terms of the politics of engagement. I think clearly that was what was most compelling for people, and both the biggest gap and the biggest challenge in this work on gender-based violence prevention. So I want to give us some space and time to get a little deeper into that, but I also want to put this question out. One of the things I think that we're getting better at understanding both the complexity and the necessity of intersectionality in our work, right? About looking at how, in a conversation I heard Alan Gregg say yesterday, these things aren't all just issues that meet at the subway station and sit around and talk for a while. They're things that are bound together in knots, right? The structural issues around economy and poverty and migration, the gender identity issues, sexuality issues, they're all tied together. And I think we do a good job of critiquing that and analyzing that, but I'm still hungry to hear more about what people think the vision is. Where do we take this? What do we do with it? What should we be striving for? Because I hear a lot of great analysis, but I still can't see the roadmap that helps us get there. And so I'm going to put that question out to the panel and have them start on it and see if there's any thoughts or any brainstorm that we can do here to help stimulate that kind of conversation. And when your own panel goes quiet, you know you're in trouble. So, G, do you want to share maybe some thoughts on that, or anyone really?
So when we're talking of structural issues, especially around property relations, I think you were mentioning that. One of the questions is actually about whether you look at it in terms of women's access to economic resources, or you look at economic resources in the continuum of caste, race, etc., etc. So if you look at ghettos in India or in North American context, you will find that a lot of immigrant communities and especially Latino and black communities live there. And a lot of the trans people also live in these ghettos, right? So when there is absolutely no economic resources for them as a community, when indigenous people's resources have been snatched away by the colonizer, and when immigrant and black communities have absolutely no economic resources, then bringing in the question of women's right to economic resources, women as a universal category, runs contrary to that. So that is part of the structural imbalance that I was talking about, and especially in the Indian context, with women's reservation as a strong demand in the parliament that was granted, a lot of people at that time had spoken about how upper caste women would then take 100% of the women's reservation that's been given and in effect raise the percentage of upper caste votes in the parliament. So the women's reservation bill has also run contrary to the idea of women's emancipation, because women does not constitute a universal category. So a lot of people have asked for reservation within reservation for other axes of disempowerment. So I think the way forward, I think, would still be taking a stock of the diversity, making it more democratic, because once you make it democratic, the experiences of the people who are sharing will naturally feature in the kind of decisions that you make. And I think that instead of also focusing on these larger things, if I were to talk about the LGBTI movement itself, you will see that in India especially, the Section 377 legal campaign has been called the gay movement or the LGBT rights movement, whereas a lot of other issues have been sidelined, especially of trans people. So even within the great LGBTI family, trans people happen to be the stepchildren who always come for the rallies for their brothers and sisters, but whose demands are never placed on the table. So if some of you remember, you would also might have read about how there was black trans people blocking the gay pride at Johannesburg a few years back. So these are the kind of internal contradictions within our communities, and unless we kind of talk about the power differences between ourselves, I don't think that we will be able to think of it in any useful way, because there are a lot of other structures that collide to give the kind of problems that we have. So recently in Ahmednagar, which is a place in Maharashtra, a family of three, the youngest was a 19-year-old boy. His body was found chopped into 40 pieces. And this has happened in 2014 because of the caste system, and you still do not have a movement to annihilate caste in this country. It's still a Dalit issue, but it's never an issue for women's rights movements, because women's rights movements, to a large extent, who are in urban spaces, are dominated by the very same people who are at the privileged end of the caste spectrum. right? So unless we democratize our spaces, I don't think any of these issues can be addressed. And I think the only way to do that would be to have more conversations with larger groups of people cutting across race, caste, and class barriers, and also genders. So I think a lot of this conversation still presupposes cisgender male and women as part of the conversation. I don't think we've been able to break that yet to include other genders. So I think at least if you're talking of in terms of a universal category, at least the universal category of gender can be broken into genders if the conversation around race, caste, and other axes is a premature one. So I hope that at least we'll start using the plural for gender instead of just gender.
Great. I can't agree more about democratizing spaces. I think it's really important. And Michael wants to jump in. And Peng, I want to ask you after that, because it's one thing to democratize a space, but as you pointed out in one of your earlier comments, you have to get people to the table, so you have to make it accessible and inclusive. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that after Michael has a go at it here.
So two comments. One is you were asking about kind of what's the roadmap to the future, and one thing I'm conscious of is I think there's very little reflection in the kind of engaging men field about what that future looks like. So there's kind of this robust and creative and really diverse feminist debates over what kind of gendered or sexual future do we want, and what kinds of gender and sexual categories, if any, do we want. And do we want gender multiculturalism or gender pluralism, or in fact the
beyond gender
deconstruction of gender and so on? And G has some very I think valuable points to make right there. But there's been very little engagement in that. The second thing is I've actually been really pleased to see in the last few months some pushback by feminists against a kind of uncritical emphasis on men's roles in building gender equality. So, for example, some various pieces criticising the kind of uncritical fawning over male celebrities, male actors who say some simplistic feminist things that other feminists have been saying for a long time.
Hold that thought.
Likewise, the holding the bar very low for what it means for men to take up this issue. And in fact, there's this he for she, Emma Watson, the thing that Emma Watson launched, I saw this blog that said, I just loved what it said. It said, I know it's hard for you to spiel serves to provide a cup of hot chocolate and a cosy blanket for men so they don't have to feel threatened. As if their privilege isn't enough to keep them warm at night. It's important that we stroke their foreheads and validate their issues as being equal to the oppression faced by women. So there's kind of placating and reassuring of men. It's not you, it's other men. It's not all men. I think we need to ask much harder questions about men's privilege in general, and the ways in which about men in general, myself and other men, are complicit in or indeed directly perpetrate various forms of coercion and violence. And so I think there's some of the ways in which the kind of issues of men and masculinity have been framed in this work are finally starting to be criticised in some valuable ways, I think.
So the one moment you have a silent panel, the next moment you have one that takes you right into the next area of conversation. So I love it. Peng, do you want to just share a few thoughts? And then this question I think that Michael's bringing up is also one that I frame in the idea of accountability. How do we maintain accountability to the work, to feminist ideologies, and to that, the multiple challenges and problems and lack of critical analysis that's been around that. So Peng will maybe go there, and then we'll shift a little bit, and then we'll get everybody else in as we kind of wrap up the session.
What came to my mind in terms of how do you get people to the table and what do you do with all these competing priorities, is that there's this really great organization in Madison, Wisconsin called Freedom Inc. And you have an organization that was founded by Hmong folks, right? But you also have black folks who are a part of that organization as well. And these two communities typically are at opposite ends. You don't find them together often because of how race plays itself out in the U.S., that black folks are often at the bottom of the echelon, and Asian folks, Hmong folks with fairer complexion are in the middle of the echelon. And so you don't see these two groups come to the table together. But what they've done in this organization is they've built beautiful partnerships and collaboration and a collective movement together between black community and the Hmong community. And that the black community shows up to the Hmong community and the Hmong community shows up to the black community. So what I mean by that is that G was talking about Michael Brown earlier, the young man that was shot in Missouri. What happened was that the Hmong folks, who were allies to the black folks who worked in the organization, asked the black folks, how did you want us to show up when you guys are protesting and rallying down in Missouri. And the black folks were, come and document us. Come and make sure that you're keeping history and somebody's witnessing what's happening. So that's what they did. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is that we need to help each other build each other's capacity on the issues that we're each working on with the intersections. But we also need to ask each other, how do we want our allies to show up in doing this work? Because if we don't ask that question, then our allies come in thinking that they already know how to do the work. And then there will be competition in funding. There will be competition in how we're going to do this work and who's going to manage it. So I think it was really great learning because that organization has brought two communities that often don't work together to come together to work. And the other really beautiful thing was that up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, they've been able to bring a lot of Hmong folks and Native American folks, indigenous folks together to talk about indigenous ways and practices, and Hmong folks sharing a lot of their own practices with Native American folks and Native American folks doing the same thing. So, and those two communities often don't talk to each other as well. So there's very, very small ways in which people are coming together, but they're also building each other's capacity and understanding and how they're also connected with each other, but they're also asking each other, how do we show up for each other as well when the system doesn't allow us to do that?
Great. So you've all now started to touch on the next section and the final section. So we're kind of going to go free for all here. I'm going to put my 3 questions out. I'm going to let these brilliant people go at it, and then I'm going to go, you brilliant people, go at it. So one was around allyship. You know, why is it that we haven't had a critical look at what it means to be a male ally in this work? Why do actors who go to a launch in New York City get here's your cookie and here, let me pat your hair, accolades, where women who've been doing this for decades, you know, struggle away in relative anonymity? And something that maybe uniquely North American and maybe Australian phenomenon too, we've had this plethora of recently quote-unquote male feminists who've been exposed for very less than ideal towards the kind of things that we all aspire to. So why can we talk the talk but we don't walk the walk as often as that? So that's one question. The second I want to ask is, if we are allies with feminist movement, are there moments where it's